Welcome to the Line Life podcast. I'm Jeff Postlethwaite, Senior Editor of T&D World, and today we're bringing you more stories of the grit, courage, and inspirational teamwork that it takes to be a line worker.
Thanks for tuning in to the Line Life podcast. My name is Amy Fishbach, and I'm the field editor for T&D World magazine. Our guest for this episode is Peter Fuhr, who leads the Grid Sensing and Communications Group at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. For this two-part series for the Line Life podcast, we're going to focus on new research involving drones and power line inspections. Because Peter lives in Florida, he's going to talk about his firsthand experience of living through Hurricane Helene. Years ago, Peter worked as an apprentice line worker in Minnesota, and he understands what our Line Life podcast listeners go through during storm response and when they have to work in very frigid conditions. And next, we're going to learn how he earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and then went to work for NASA, and then on to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Then Peter will give an overview of the way that drones are used in the utility industry. For part 2, he'll share more about the actual research, which will be a game changer for the utility industry. So look for that episode coming up soon for the Line Life podcast at linelife.podbean.com. But first, let's listen in on my conversation with Peter for the first part of this series. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today for the Line Life podcast.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
So, Peter, you live in Florida right now. Just to begin, can you talk a little bit about Hurricane Helene and how that has impacted your community there?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, yeah. Even though with Hurricane Milton coming right on the tail end of this thing,
Right.
Helene really came through where I live, which is north of Gainesville. And so it made landfall up in an area called the Big Bend. It's about 40 miles away from here. And with 140 mile an hour winds and big surge and all sorts of stuff. And it just, devastated. You've seen the pictures, maybe.
Yes.
And it's just devastated coastal communities and things like that. Way back in time, if I really hit back in time, I was an apprentice lineman for a rural electric cooperative up in northern Minnesota, don't you know?
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah, so given that as a background, it's like I'm always just looking like, okay, what's happening here? In my particular world, we were without power for 3.5 days, which meant we were without internet also, and communications were messed up. And how do you get your well to work to take care of the animals and us humans, etc.? And all of that comes into play. I was told that there were over 30,000 line workers that came into Florida in anticipation and then during this particular event to try to help with Helene. I have a dear friend, a neighbor across the street, and they have a pepper farm. I think it's maybe 100 acres or something like that. And 70% of the crop was just wiped out. And we didn't get the rain that happened up in Appalachian where it's terrible, just terrible. So we just had the winds. And so my perspective is given that I used to work a shovel an awful lot as an apprentice line worker. And I climbed some poles at different times. And sometimes in the cold, sometimes in the not so cold in northern Minnesota. But to see what the line workers were dealing with here, post-hurricane, and prepping for the next hurricane that's supposed to hit in 2 days, it brings a lot of stuff to focus.
Absolutely. So, Peter, before we dive into learning more about drones, I have to learn a little bit more about you being an apprentice line worker in Minnesota. That's fascinating. How did you get interested in that?
Happenstance. So I was from a small town called Pelican Rapids up in north central Minnesota, over by Fargo and the Dakotas in that particular area. And again, small town, population probably 2,000 or something like that. And our rural electric co-op, Lake Region Rural Electric Co-op, was based in Pelican Rapids. I was fortunate enough to apply for a job there as a summer student. I was going to college, and I was selected, and here we go. So, first thing I did was reading meters. I did this for quite a while. And then every time I had a semester break, I continued to work at the co-op and just got to experience what life is like for the line workers and the staff themselves of a small rural electric co-op with a large physical geographical footprint in an area that's basically vacation homes on the lakes, and the issues associated with no one being there for many months because it's so snowy. And that's how I got started in it.
So did you top out as a journeyman then?
Now, from that particular experience, like I said, I was doing that while going to undergraduate school at a college in Wisconsin called Beloit College. in Beloit, I majored in physics and I also majored in math. And my last stint back at the utility, I was getting closer and I was actually given a truck and I could go out and assist some people on disconnects, which is a very tough thing to do for a line person. Going to some particular place, maybe a home, maybe an establishment where they're way behind. And you got to shut off the power, but oh boy, it's pulling at the heartstrings. So at the end of all of that, I decided this is not my career. I'm not going to be a line person. I'm just not cut out for that. And I continued, and then I went to work at NASA. And I went to graduate school and got a master's and PhD in electrical engineering. But always like look over my shoulder about what is it like to be a lineman working in some pretty crazy situations.
That is fascinating. So you're an apprentice line worker who eventually worked for NASA.
Yep.
That's really cool. I love that. That's a really neat story.
Yeah.
And also in Minnesota, which can be quite cold. I mean, much colder than here in Kansas City, I'm sure. I bet you had some severe weather that you had to respond to.
You are just teeing this up for me. Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate that. So indeed, one of the things. So there's a specific time when it was a fall semester that I had taken off from college. Okay, it was just like, I need a break. So I took a fall semester off versus the standard, you're going to be off during the summer. Nope, it was the fall. Right after Thanksgiving, but before Christmas. In that particular time, what do? Well, I'm going to assist because it's cold. A cold snap came through. Like, oh my goodness, cold. And I'm from Minnesota, don't you know? It was cold, but this is crazy. So we were in a particular place in northwestern Minnesota where most of the electrical lines were made using copper and brass that were spent shells from World War II. Basically, you got the shells, you melted them down, and you made electrical line. Now, the deal here is the following. That particular material has a fairly high coefficient of thermal expansion or contraction. So, the lines would sag like they always do. Thank you, physics and mathematics, to describe that. That's great. But in the coldness, they would tighten up a lot. And we had lines that were snapping or popping off the insulators that were in various poles because of the contraction that was happening on the lines due to the cold. How cold was it? 45 below zero. And then it was windy on top of that. And so what we would do is basically have 3 trucks. We're in a very remote part of northwestern Minnesota. And essentially, you kept the truck running all the time. And you would spend 5 minutes outside, maybe 10, actually doing some work, and then get back in the truck to warm up and just back and forth. Between that and then the summer with all the mosquitoes and bugs, I figured I am not cut out as a line worker.
But you have an understanding of line workers now because you worked in the field, which is fabulous.
Yep.
Because what we're going to talk about today is drone technology. So we've heard a lot about drones lately in the utility industry and how they can save time and improve safety for line workers and utilities. Can you talk about the advancements in drone technology?
I will, and thank you again for that question. So I'm fortunate enough to be the technical director of our national lab's Unmanned Aerial Systems Research Center, UAS. Some people call it UAVs. It goes by all sorts of names. I'm just going to refer to them as drones. Okay. Back in the day, you'd call it a remote control airplane or some helicopter or something like that. I'm just going to call them drones. So a number of years ago, we were, sort of looking at technology here at the lab. Oh, by the way, we're in East Tennessee. That's where ORNL is based. So we were looking at some stuff, developing some different types of sensors and things like that. We're talking 7-10 years ago. And we were making them into boxes, into NEMA 4X enclosures that could measure a whole bunch of stuff inside an electrical substation. So these were just classic sensors. Temperatures, chemicals, see if there's anything leaking or leaching out from the big transformers that are at substations. We had other sorts of things. And a colleague and I decided, what we should do? We should fly this stuff. Instead of just mounting it on a pole, we can fly this. The drone world was just starting to wake up for real. And we're not talking military things. That's a whole different world. Kamikaze drones, one directional, they know what their thing is. And we were looking at, hey, if we had a drone situated here at the substation, but we treat it like a platform, because all it does is fly sensors around. let's see if we can do that. And we did. And so that started about 7 years ago. And said, oh, okay, we were working with a utility. The utility is the Electric Power Board, or EPB, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And this is a distribution utility. They have about 230 or 240,000 customers. I may get that plus or minus. 600 square mile service area. Lots of stuff in southeast Tennessee. So we worked with them quite a bit. Wonderful. We continue to do that. And that was us starting with different types of sensors, using a drone as a platform.
I think I heard about this technology a long time ago. It was like a drone in the box or something. Yeah. And okay. And now you've kind of taken that to the next level. So talk about how Oak Ridge National Laboratory actually demonstrated this approach at the training facility in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Yeah, nice try, Jedi Warrior. I'm not done with the last question.
Okay, no, go ahead. Talk about the last question.
Yeah, so the thing is the following. So all of a sudden it was, wait a second, we can have a remote control airplane or a helicopter, a quadcopter, call it a drone. And there was a convergence that was happening. Some of it was the miniaturization of types of sensors. And the other thing were improvements in variable speed motors, little motors that wouldn't require so much current that they just kill the battery within, a couple minutes. It was crazy. I was mentioning batteries. Battery tech was clicking in. 3D printing was starting to come around. And what you got out of this was, hey, you can have a miniature camera, and I can put that camera on a drone. And that's what happened in the commercial sector. So all of a sudden you had a drone, and most people were then associating that with the camera and all sorts of things. And the prices really plummeted because you could mass produce these things. They're not asking for a lot. And numerous companies, I've been to so many conferences and done little presentations, whatever. And so many companies were then saying, hey, I want to do vegetation management for the utilities using this drone with a camera. Mm-hmm. So instead of having somebody climbing through the brush or the chiggers or whatever, fill in the blank you want, we could just fly a drone to look where the branches are and do vegetation management from an imaging perspective. And that's happening right now. The commercial side is doing great, just great. What we decided to do at the lab was, okay, wait a second. That's wonderful. The private sector is doing a really nice job. The utilities, some utilities want that in-house, the capability in-house, with their own employees and train them and get certified, FAA regulations and rules, etc. Others are saying, no, I'm just going to contract it out. Both work, but the initial foray was vegetation management. Well, the sensors have been getting better. And some of it was pushed by us and others in both academia, private sector, certainly in national labs and around the planet. It's like, oh, we can have some other types of sensors and treat the drone as a platform, just bringing the sensors to what you want to actually measure. And that's what we started doing at ORNL. It continues, but that's it for right now.
That is fascinating, Peter, just hearing kind of the evolution of the drones. To listen to the second part of my conversation with Peter, make sure you stay tuned to the Line Life podcast at linelife.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Line Life podcast.
This episode of the Line Life podcast was written, recorded, and edited by Amy Fishbach. It was produced by Jeff Postlethwaite. That's me. To listen to past episodes, visit www.tdworld.com/podcasts or find us at Podbean. You could also drop us a voice memo or message at linelifepodcast@gmail.com with your comments on this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Please follow this show on Podbean or your favorite podcasting app to be updated when new episodes are released. Thank you for listening.